And good afternoon. I think we should also acknowledge Thea Seagraves in the back, who's serving as our usher, and in a couple of minutes the bouncer. Thea is our director of education here, and she recruited me to do various tasks at the museum, and I worked my way up to get an opportunity to present this today. I want to thank our curator, Isabel, for her guidance on this project, keeping it on the rails. Otherwise, with my first rewrite, you would have been here all afternoon. I also want to thank my ever-patient wife, Barb, who prepared the PowerPoint we're going to see in a minute, and also the charcuterie board in the back, and that's complimentary. Thank you for Okay, enterprise, that's a noun. A project or undertaking that is especially difficult, complicated, or risky. The enterprise of Florida was a national enterprise, undertaken at the national charge with the Royal Commission and under the Royal Standard of France, and it had been crushed in the time of peace by a power professing the closest friendship. And that's from Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. At the end of the Cold War, Madeleine Albright described the United States as the indispensable nation. In the year 1500, the same could have been said of France. Having established Francia in 481, from the remnants of the Western Roman Empire, the French weathered failed crusades, the Black Death, and an existential war with England to once again claim primacy among the nations of Europe. However, over the course of the 16th century, France would find herself challenged east and west by a rising new power, Spain. Our story today will discuss this rivalry, in particular as it related to the first ever military operations by European powers in what was to become America, the final campaign of which was launched right here on Amelia Island. So this is a map of Spain circa 1940. Like France, Hispania had been a Roman province. After sacking Rome in 410, the Visigoths established a kingdom there. The Arabs conquered the peninsula in 720, and for 7 centuries, Al-Andalus was a war zone between Muslim states and their dynasties and the Christians pushing back from the far north of the country. They were pushed all the way up to Asturia in the far north, and then they came down, centuries of warfare. In 1491, the Christian Reconquista of Spain was completed when Granada fell to Ferdinand and Isabel. As you can see, 1492 was kind of a banner year for our Iberian power couple. They established control over the entirety of Spain. They expelled the Moors and, the Jews, who wouldn't convert to their form of very militant Catholicism. By commissioning Columbus to reach the Indies by sailing west, they hoped to bypass the Ottoman Turks who had captured Constantinople in 1453, thus blocking European access to the lucrative Silk Road to China, India, and the Spice Islands of Indonesia. Columbus never reached Asia, as we know, not even close. However, the explorers and fierce conquistadors who followed in his wake would make Spain fabulously wealthy from gold and silver pilfered from indigenous empires in Mexico and Peru, One land they discovered, however, proved to be a disappointment. Okay, so we were taught that Spaniard Ponce de Leon discovered Florida in 1513. Well, we can tell from this map that kind of really looks like Florida. I'm not sure if these are just puzzle pieces or actual islands, but they knew about Florida. So de Leon wasn't the first to come here. However, coming upon the shoreline at Easter time, Pascua Florida, or the Feast of Flowers in Spanish, he named the land La Florida, and it stuck. De Leon is also credited with the discovery of the Gulf Stream that would be the superhighway for Spanish treasure fleets heading back to Europe for centuries afterwards. De Leon himself would be killed in 1521 by Florida natives as he was exploring the Gulf Coast around Naples. That wasn't all for Spain. A second major effort in 1527, led by Panfilo Narvaez, saw 300 Spaniards land near Tampa Bay, only to miss their rendezvous with their support fleet. Eventually, only 4 stalwart survivors stumbled into Mexico City in 1536, having walked the entire, as then unexplored, north coast of the Gulf of Mexico. In May of 1539, Hernando de Soto, who had become wealthy as a leading participant in Pizarro's destruction of the Peruvian Empire, invested his personal fortune and landed on Florida's coast with 650 soldiers, priests, 200 horses, war dogs, and a very large herd of pigs. Much debate has followed about this expedition through the American Southwest, what they might have discovered, such as the Mississippi River or not. Suffice it to say, De Soto's extreme coercive methods to obtain food, along with the destruction his war dogs and hundreds of hogs caused to the indigenous people and their food supplies, chronic warfare erupted along his route. De Soto died of a fever in May of 1542, and only a fraction of his men subsequently reached Mexico, this time in locally crafted boats. Eventually, in 1561, after upwards of 8 failed attempts, King Philip II of Spain, a great-grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, decreed Florida was off limits to future exploration, colonies, or religious missions. No more Spanish lives or money was to be wasted there. However, Spain wasn't the only country interested in Florida. For a century, fishermen from Brittany casually surveyed the coast of Terra de Briton. More concretely, in 1524, 500 years ago, Giovanni Verrazzano sailed into New York Harbor and claimed New Gallia for his employer, Francis I of France. And here's a map of what they found. His brother did that in 1529. You see Florida down here. And you also see the Spanish coat of arms there for La Florida. So they were aware that the Spanish were there, and there were their claims to that land. The travails of Francis I bring our story back to Europe, where he was occupied winning, then losing battles in an attempt to control the rich city-states of Italy. In February 24th, anniversary coming up, 1525, Francis's army was routed, and he himself taken prisoner by Charles V, another great-grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. You can see there's a lot of inbreeding here. But Charles V controls both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. So France has competition both east and west, and so they feel they're facing another existential threat like they had with England. To Francis's credit, he was considered a man of letters who brought Leonardo da Vinci to France, where he spent his last days. He introduced Italian food and dress and found an Italian bride from the house of de Medici for his son, King Henry II. Another less savory import was the political teachings of Niccolò Machiavelli, whose Dark Prince was widely read by the middle of the century. So this is statues down in the Leitner Museum down in St. Augustine, and it's kind of the CV of some of the high points of Charles V's reign. It didn't end well. He had to make compromise eventually with the Lutherans in his realm, and he retired to a monastery, and he abdicated in favor of his brother, who took over Austria-Hungary, and his son Philip II, who gets Spain and the colonies. Here's Philip II. I didn't know this. Philippine Islands were named for him when he was still a prince. So you're looking at an empire on which the sun never set by the time he's all said and done, because he later on takes over the Portuguese empire as well. He married Queen Mary Tudor. Does anybody know the nickname for her? Bloody Mary, right. The drink and the lady, both kind of spicy. She got that name by persecuting Protestants within her realm. She was married to Philip. So you had Spanish Empire, England, all under one roof. She died of cancer, and because of Spanish Inquisition forcing Catholic orthodoxy, Philip II took control of Spain after his father's abdication, and he had little trouble with dissent because of the Spanish Inquisition. His problem was keeping a wife and producing an heir to the throne. The second of his wives was Mary Tudor, daughter of King Henry VIII of Spain, and she died in 1558. So, what to do? They decided to make peace and end decades of the Italian wars between France and Spain. And here's Henry II embracing Philip of Spain. So along with the usual horse trading that goes into any good peace deal, the 13-year-old daughter of Catherine and Henry of France is packed off to Madrid to become the third wife of Philip II. So here we've got frenemies. We have Catherine de Medici, her husband Henry II, their son Charles IX, for whom Charles Fort will be named, and their daughter Elizabeth. She becomes Queen Consort of Spain, married to Philip, and they have a daughter who later would go on to be sovereign of the Netherlands. So you have this competition, and then you also have kind of close family ties. So you think they'd be able to work it out. Henry II is probably best known for his death in a jousting tournament to celebrate the marriage of Elizabeth to Philip, being predicted by mysterious court astrologer and seer Nostradamus. His death left Catherine de Medici as ruler of France. Catherine tried to appease the religious factions in France by not picking one group over the other. Unlike Francis and Henry, she gave power where power was due to the Huguenots. The Huguenots were followers of John Calvin, who had taught in France and was exiled to Geneva because of his rather radical interpretation of the theory of predestination, who would get into heaven and who wouldn't. His followers came to be called Huguenots, and by the time of Catherine's reign, they comprised roughly 10% of the French population. So this is a shot down here at Fort Caroline. Anybody? Everybody's been there? Anybody been there? I found it interesting that above the gateway are the arms of Gaspar Coligny, Lord of Chatillon, Admiral of France, and not for whom the fort is named, Charles IX. Like the English pilgrims of 1620, Coligny dreamed of planting Protestant enclaves in the New World. The first attempt in South America failed miserably. For the second attempt, he found a man who most felt was up to the task, Jean Ribault. So Ribault was legend here on Amelia Island, and it turns out he was a pretty good guy too. He's described as distinguished man of high qualities, devout of the best spirit of reform, with a human heart under his steel breastplate. So, and that was a description given to him by the cartographer and painter Lemoyne, who survived the attack on Fort Caroline, but blamed Renault for it happening. So this wasn't a friend so much as somebody who gave credit where credit was due. So, Ribault organized the fleet, sailed on February 15th, 1562, and arrived off the Florida coast on May 1st. Francis Parkman describes the scene. On the next morning, the 1st of May, they found themselves off the mouth of a great river. Riding at anchor on a sunny sea, they lowered their boats, crossed the bar that obstructed the entrance, and floated on a basin of deep and sheltered water. Boiling and roaring, says Ribault, through the multitude of all kinds of fish. Indians were running along the beach and out on the sandbars, beckoning them to land. They pushed their boats ashore and disembarked, soldiers, sailors, and eager young nobles. Kneeling on the ground, they gave thanks to God, who had guided their voyage to an issue full of promise. The Indians, seated gravely under the neighboring trees, looked on in silent respect, thinking that they worshipped the sun. Ribault writes, they be all naked and of a goodly nature, mighty and well-shapen in proportion to body as any people in the world. And for part of their bodies and arms be painted with pretty works of azure, red, and black, so well and so properly as the best painter of Europe could not amend it. With their women and children, they drew near and strewed the earth with laurel boughs, sat down among the French. So we'll go back to Parkman real quick. On the next morning, Ribault wrote, we returned to land again and accompanied with captains, gentlemen, and soldiers, and others of our small troop, carrying with us a pillar of hard stone, our king's arms engraved therein, to plant and set the same in the entry of the port, and being come hither, we espied on the south side of the river a place very fit for that purpose upon a little hill. Here they set the column, and then, again embarking, held their course northward, happy in that divine decree that locks from mortal eyes the secrets of the future. The next day they anchored near Fernandina, and to a neighboring river, the St. Mary's, gave the name the River Seine. Up here you can kind of see that jagged tooth that you recognize from northern Florida. As morning broke on the fresh, moist meadows hung with mists, and on the broad reaches of inland waters which seemed like lakes, they were tempted to land again, and soon espied innumerable number of footsteps of great hares and hinds of a wonderful greatness, the steps being all fresh and new, and it seemeth that the people doth nourish them like tame cattle. So that's a pretty good travel brochure right there, right? By 2 weeks of exploration, they seem to have gained a clear idea of this rich semi-aquatic region. Ribault describes it as a country full of havens, rivers, and islands of such fruitfulness as cannot with tongue be expressed. Slowly moving northward, they named each river or inland to be supposed to be a river after some stream of France. After length landing betwixt flat and sandy shores, they saw a commodious haven. They went in and named it Port Royal. Has anybody been up to Paris Island? Okay, thank you. Okay. Get here. So, Paris Island, the first stronghold of France on this continent. And there's a pillar, looks very much like the pillar that you see also on the St. John's Bluff, one of the busiest, most popular beaches in the world, of course, is Colony Beach at Hilton Head. Very few people know why it's named that. And then here's the actual site of where the fort was. It was abandoned and taken over by the Spanish, and then abandoned again. Colony's plan was to resupply the colony from France. So Ribault built a small fort and sailed home. He asked 20-odd volunteers to stay behind, and they did, but they eventually ran out of food and built a craft to sail back to France. It worked out, but not for everybody. They had to resort to cannibalism, and they drew lots, and one guy lost, and he didn't make the trip. So this is probably the part you're more familiar with. Undaunted, Colony sends another expedition in 1564, the religious strife in France having temporarily abated. The French return to the River of May, St. John's. Saint-Cyrois helps them build a fort, hoping to make an alliance with the French when he realized they planned to stay this time. So here's the fort and the river at the fleur-de-lis of France there. And life started in Florida for the French. What were they there for? To become colonists, farmers? No. They were there looking for gold and the riches. So much to Saint-Cyrois' disgust, the leader, Laudonnière, instead became an ally of Otina, Saint-Cyrois' enemy, in hopes of finding gold further south on the river, there being none in Saint-Cyrois' land. So this is the, I guess, the whole is, Isabel lectured me yesterday, the whole region is speaking the Timucua language, but the different tribes have their own identities, and Up here you see Amelia Island, and there were the Macoma. So, Atina. Nobody around to say I don't pronounce that right, but that's what we'll call him. So he was an interesting guy. He was looking for the French help, but he wasn't quite sure what the outcome would be. And so he took a drug to give him a vision of the outcome, and it wasn't good. So they said, well, we're not going to go with you. And the French said, oh, yes, you are. We came all this way. And they did indeed attack Fontenay, Otina's enemies, and they defeated them, took some captives, and had bragging rights for a while. I don't think any of those campaigns were ever too lasting. So, just a note here, there's a very interesting exhibit downstairs about the Macoma, and I invite you either today or some other time to visit and see more about the lifestyle of the people who lived here. They were healthy, and except for the chief, who was allowed some liberties, strictly honored marriage. Food was gathered by all, brought to the chief, and distributed equally, providing for widows and orphans. Unfortunately, they couldn't. That's sort of a team effort there, right, with the alligator? Flip him over and kill him. And of course, it's been made overly dramatic to spike European interest in the beasts of Florida. So the Macoma would eat deer, turkeys, fish, oysters, and alligators, made for a protein-rich diet. Hence, the Macoma were much taller than the French. So it's about 15 months that the French were here, and they accomplished some firsts that are often ascribed to other places, like Virginia Dare, the first European born in North America. No. The first Thanksgiving. No. It all happened just a few miles south of us down in Mayport. So this sign is put up by Charles Bennett. He wrote a book about Laudonnière and Fort Caroline in the mid-1960s, probably on the 400th anniversary of the French fort. And he was a Florida congressman for a long time, and he also was instrumental in establishing Fort Caroline Monument. And he's one of the sources that I use for the depictions here.
Where is that historic marker actually located?
When you take the Mayport, the Jean Ribault over to Mayport, it's right there in the parking lot. It's kind of cool. A lot of people are from other places, going to take somebody visiting, show them something. I like to run them down to Mayport, go on a ferry for 15 minutes, and then, you know, point out some of the history. So things got bad. There's some interaction with a supply ship, very meager supplies. There's an interaction with a pirate, English pirate, John Hawkins, bless you. And things aren't just going well. And Laudonnière decides, okay, we're going to pull up stakes and we're going to go home. No sooner than that decision was made to leave, then Jean Ribault arrived with hundreds of more settlers in September 1565. Given authority over Laudonnière by Coligny, the decision was made to stay on in Florida. No sooner than that decision was made than foreign sails appeared at the mouth of the St. John's River, or the River of May as they called it. The fleet of Pedro Menéndez, Aldentalado, of Florida had arrived. The fleets closed, but the French cut their anchors and sailed away. Seeing his ships had too much draft to go upriver and attack the fort, Menéndez sailed away to the River of Dolphins, where he established America's oldest city, St. Augustine. So, what's going to happen? There's no avoiding war. It can only be postponed to the advantage of others. Ribault, feeling his odds were better by going by sea to attack Menéndez, Ribault not only takes his new force of men by sea to find Menéndez, but he augments it by most of the able-bodied men still at Fort Caroline. Laudonnière and Lemoyne, the artist, object, feeling that's going to leave Fort Caroline unprotected. But they're overruled, and the die was cast. The fate of French Florida was about to unfold. Down in St. Augustine, Menéndez has much the same pushback. People saying, well, if you leave with your men, Ribault will come back and we'll be slaughtered. But, as one of his chroniclers said, Menéndez was a fan of his own opinion, a friend of his own opinion. And he marched through the wilds of Florida. These roads obviously aren't all here. He does go. He does go by 2.5 days on September 18th. He goes through the woods, guided by a French trader, Francis Jean, and 2 Indians. And on the feast of San Mateo, they're outside of Fort Caroline. Now the French have posted no guards because they're convinced nobody would attack in that weather. Not a sentry was on the rampart. Levine, the officer of the guard, had just gone to his quarters, but his trumpeter, who chanced to remain, saw through sheets of rain the swarms of assailants sweeping down the hill. He blew the alarm, and the summons brought a few half-naked soldiers wildly out of the barracks. It was too late. Through the breaches and over the ramparts, the Spanish came pouring in with shouts of Santiago, Santiago. Sick men leaped from their beds. Women and children, blind with fright, darted shrieking from the houses. A fierce, gaunt visage, the thrust of a pike, or blow of a rusty halberd, such were the greeting that met all alike, men and children, men and women, until at some point Menéndez called them off. Roughly 150 French perished that night, with only 1 Spaniard badly hurt. To add to the infamy, Menéndez hanged several survivors under a sign saying, "Hung not as Frenchmen, but as Lutherans." 2 small ships that didn't go with Ribault escaped with a few score survivors, including the artist Lemoyne, who created the works that we're familiar with. Some are in the Library of Congress from memory. He lost all his stuff and left it behind at the fort. And Laudonnière, although he was sick and then wounded in the attack, he also makes it on board these 2 ships, and they sail away to safety. Meanwhile, Ribault has been shipwrecked along with all of the ships he commanded in the tempest that struck Florida in September. No surprise there. So again, we go back to our political philosopher. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. Niccolo Machiavelli. Menéndez names the fort San Mateo in honor of his victory there, and changes the name of the river from the River May to the San Juan or St. John's, the river, the name it retains today. He received news that French people were coming up the shore, also headed in the direction of Fort Caroline, and he organizes men to go and meet them. The French are stalled at the Matanzas intersection, water, bay, and they can't get across. They're starving, and Menéndez says, "Hey, come on over, I'll feed you. I'll have to tie your hands up because there's so many of you. There's 150 of you. I only have 50 men. Come on over, we'll work this out." One group of men come over, they're fed, taken over the dunes and executed. A second group, this group was with Ribault. He comes and he takes the same decision. They're going to starve. Menéndez might be a man of honor, offered him a huge reward if he would spare him and his men. Note payable once I get back to France. Menéndez refuses and said, you put your hands in the trust of me and my God, and we'll decide what to do with you. And that was similar. He took him over the dunes and executed him. Ribault supposedly sang a psalm as he died, "Remember me, Lord." Okay. Now we're going to get to the really bloody part. Of course, news of this eventually reached Philip's brother-in-law in Paris. The French king protested the affront to France, the Spanish ambassador, stating the French were within their rights to settle wherever they wished in Terre des Britons, which he contended extended down to the Gulf of Mexico. Philip, for his part, told his ambassador not to apologize, but rather to raise the issue of French trespass on Spanish territory because in Spanish minds, Florida extended north to the Arctic Circle. So ignoring his own edict of 1561 for Spaniards to forever steer clear of La Florida, furthermore, Philip suggested to his brother-in-law that Coligny should be punished for his trespass. Just because Philip had indicated he didn't want Florida, that didn't imply France could have it. At least not without a fight, was Philip's message, and the weak and feckless French court did little more than protest this egregious affront to their honor, to the honor of France. And as Parkman writes, in vain the relatives of the slain petitioned him for redress, and had the honor of the nation rested in the keeping of his king, the bloods of hundreds of murdered Frenchmen would have cried from the ground in vain. But it was not to be so. Injured humanity found an avenger and outraged France a champion. Her chivalrous annals may be searched in vain for a deed of more romantic daring than the vengeance of Dominique de Gorges. De Gorges had an interesting life. He was a child soldier in the wars in Italy. He was captured, put on board a Spanish galley as a galley slave, and his galley was captured by the Ottomans, but he still was a galley slave. And then a third time, the Knights of Malta captured the Turkish ship, and he was freed, and he began his career as a naval officer. So de Gorges, when he hears of what happened at Fort Caroline, outfits 2 ships at his own expense. And this is a common theme for Florida. A lot of times the kings didn't have the money, so they farmed it out to people like Menéndez, who financed his expedition. De Gorges, who financed his expedition. Menéndez was promised to be the commander, the overlord of Florida for life. He could name a successor, take a big slice of the profits. De Gorges was just simply out to avenge the honor of France, and he did it out of his own pocket. Outfitting his ships, the story ostensibly was to go to Benin, get slaves, bring them to the Spanish in the West Indies, but his real purpose was to go to avenge the French at, a little bit ahead of here, oops, back. Okay, so where did all this happen? The Spanish had built 2 supporting forts up here. Think of San Mateo, formerly Fort Caroline, over here, and they built 2 forts here, Fort George Island and Mayport. De Gorges sails by. The Spanish think their ships. They shoot a salute, and Parkman writes, De Gorges' ships replied, then stood out to sea and were lost in the shades of evening. They kept their course all night, and as day broke, anchored at the mouth of a river, the St. Mary's, by their reckoning 15 leagues north of the River of May. Here as it grew light, de Gorges saw the borders of the sea thronged with Indians armed and plumed for war. They too had mistaken the strangers for Spaniards and mustered to meet the pirates at the landing. But in the French ships was a trumpeter who had been long in Florida, and he knew the Indians well. He went towards them in a boat, and with many gestures of friendship, no sooner was he recognized than the naked crowd, with yelps of delight, danced for joy along the sands. Why had he ever left them, they asked, and why had he not returned home before? The intercourse thus auspiciously begun was actively kept up. De Gorges told the principal chief, who was none other than Saturewa, once an ally of the French, that had come to visit them, make friendship with them, and bring them presents. At this announcement, so grateful to Indian ears, the dancing was renewed with double zeal. The next morning was named for Grand Council, and Saturewa set runners to summon all Indians within call, while de Gorges, for safety, brought the vessel within the mouth of the river. I think you could imagine up on Old Town, all the French ships in that little roadstead up there. Saturewa was overjoyed. Here was a Frenchman who would fight his enemies. He had just one further request, sort of a close the deal. He asked de Gorges for some of his French clothing to wear in the battle. And we'll see that coming up. It took 3 days to gather the Macama warriors. Then, after a full day of war dances, the respective allies left for battle, the French by boat and the Macama by land, marching down Amelia Island. The French met them at the Nassau River and ferried them across. The next night they slept in the woods of a cold Florida spring. So this is sort of a time lapse. It was common. This is a 3-day event. This is the first forts that were near Fort George Island and Mayport, and you see here's Saturewa here wearing some bloomers from de Gorges, and also here this is the nephew, Ola Taraka, who is a great warrior the Spaniard opens up his gun and he's got a couple shots off and he's killed a number of men. And Ola Taraka jumps up and he runs him through from front to back with the Spanish pike. So you see here the Makama swimming across, the French are coming across in boats. The second fort, they see them coming and they say, we're out of here. And they actually try to escape through the woods, but they're cut down. So the next day is Quasimodo Sunday, and the week after Easter, and the French are preparing ladders for the main assault on the fort, some miles away. They capture a spy who tells them there are still 260 Spaniards in the fort. The Spaniards believe the French number 2,000. The next day they try to break out. They try to go over here, and the Indians are waiting, and the Makama are here waiting, and the French are over here, and it's a disaster. De Gorge holds some Spaniards as prisoners, then has them hanged under a sign that reads, not as Spaniards, but as to traitors, robbers, and murderers. De Gorge credits God for the victory, as did Menéndez his. Parkman writes, thus Spaniards and Frenchmen alike laid their reeking swords on God's altar. So, I think what we'll do, kind of speed up. Whatever happened to Colony, that's kind of the original blood wedding for you Game of Thrones fans. The Huguenots were invited to Paris for the wedding of Catherine's daughter, Queen Margot, and thousands were murdered, their bodies thrown in the Seine. There's Catherine on the bottom picture, kind of overseeing what happened that day. To her credit, she also had the Tuileries Gardens built in Paris. So if you've ever been there, that was her work. And also, this summer, the Olympic flame was raised from the gardens. So that's her legacy. She sees 3 sons become King of France, die on the throne. The wedding was for Henry Bourbon to her daughter. Here's Henry being protected by Queen Margot. He survives the attack, but promises to be Catholic. As soon as he gets loose, he recants. Then it's the War of the Three Henrys. He prevails, but he can't conquer Paris. Finally, the Parisians say, we'll be with you, but you gotta become a Catholic. So he famously says, Paris is worth a mass, becomes Catholic, and he's got this famous bridge, if you've been to Paris, the Pont Neuf, the new bridge, which is actually the oldest bridge in Paris, but it was new in that you could walk out on it and see the river. And there's equestrian statues there. He issued the Edict of Nantes that allowed the Protestants and the Huguenots to practice freely. And that held until his grandson, Louis the Grand, revoked the Edict of Nantes. At that point, more Huguenots left France, including the Revere family. All Revere. Revere were. They were Huguenots. Menéndez statue. For Bennett said in his book, it was telling that there was no statue from Menéndez at St. Augustine. The people of Avila, Spain said, well, okay, that's not good. So they sent one over. Had he not done what he did, how would have our history changed? St. Augustine was protecting the flank of all those Spanish fleets that went to build the Escorial Palace and finance the Spanish Golden Age. So here's a man following the tenets of Machiavelli. He got it done, and Florida stayed Spanish for another 250 years. So whatever happened to Fort Caroline and San Mateo? We think we know where they are, but there's never been any evidence that where the current monument is accurate. There's been proposals that it was up in Georgia or here. The problem with that is Menéndez took 2 days to go from St. Augustine to Fort Caroline. He had no boats. When they came to a stream, they had to ford across. Those who could swim would hold their pikes and guide the people who couldn't swim across. There's no way they could have done that on the St. Mary's. It just wouldn't have happened. So it's there. We just haven't found it yet, which is interesting. What we have found is the wreck of the La Trinity. And the, of course, priceless cannons. That was found off of Cape Canaveral. And I'm actually talking to the French embassy in Miami, which is handling the matter, and when they get the money and everybody signs off on it, the monument will be displayed in Florida somewhere. Now, my personal hope is it'll be displayed somewhere on the grounds of Kennedy Space Center near Cape Canaveral, where it was found. This would forever link the enterprise of Florida with our space coast and humankind's greatest, riskiest enterprise ever, the exploration of space.
You can click.
Oh.
Or I can click, but
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Thank you. Any questions?
if you have any questions, that's the moment.
Well, one archaeologist I know at UNF says Fort Caroline is probably in the middle of the St. John River because the river has moved so much that wherever it was, it's been
Yeah, well, all the hurricanes over 500 years.
Yeah.
It's kind of a no-brainer to think it's there.
looking for it on land is probably pointless. It's probably in the bottom of the river somewhere.
Yeah, hey, thanks very much. I'll do the best I can.
Thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you for coming.